Whenever we listen to gospel passages, it seems almost too frequent that Pharisees and tax collectors are mentioned. And I think this gospel really encourages us to stop for a minute before we get into the meat of what Jesus is trying to communicate and remind ourselves first, who are the Pharisees and who are the tax collectors? Because then the rest of the story might not have the impact that Jesus would want it to have. But there's yet still a third character that we need to bring into this parable, because the people listening to the parable would have automatically known and assumed this third character being present, that being the Roman Empire. So who are the Pharisees? The Pharisees believed that the Roman Empire was the enemy of the people. They were oppressing the people. They were trying to get the people to turn to idolatry and the pagan gods of Rome. They were doing all kinds of terrible stuff to the Israelites. So the Pharisees believed that the solution to the Roman problem was moral perfection. They believed that there was this requirement that God had offered to the people. Excuse me. And God expected the people to be perfect, morally perfect. There were 613 rules in the moral law of the Torah, and the Pharisees were self-appointed. Nobody gave them this job. They took it on themselves. They said, we, as a community of Pharisees, we are going to force the people to be morally perfect, to follow all of these rules. And if the people don't follow these rules, we are going to oppress them, persecute them, and even possibly stone them to death. Think of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. So the Pharisees was this large community of people who were going around and quite literally acting as the morality police. Now the reason they were doing this was because they believed that if they could get the people to be faithful to the covenant, then God, because he would be pleased with their moral perfection, God would then take up a violent response against the Romans. God would destroy the Romans and kick them out. This was the Pharisee solution to the occupation of the Roman Empire. Get the people to be perfect, and then God will do violence on their behalf and kick out the Romans. Now the tax collectors are the exact opposite end from the Pharisees. Because when Rome would occupy a territory, Rome would not put their own people, a Roman soldier or a Roman citizen, as the tax collector. They would collect a lot of taxes, but they would never do it themselves. They would hire a local citizen. They would hire one of the members of that community to be something like a traitor to the people. So any Jewish citizen who would become a tax collector was collaborating with the enemy, was a traitor to their own people. And in the process, they got famously rich. Because the Romans would say to the tax collector, okay, this is how much money we need you to collect every year. Whatever you collect over and above that, you get to keep. In fact, you get to determine, the tax collector, you get to determine your own salary. So if we ask you to collect this much, but you collect double or triple what we ask, no problem, enjoy yourself. This is the way the Romans would get local people to collect taxes over and against their own. So the tax collectors were deeply hated people because they were seen as traitors and collaborators with the enemy. They were also oppressing the people, but through taxes. But not only that, they would take their newfound wealth and they would live big lives. They would throw parties, they would entertain their friends, and we hear all throughout the Gospels there seems to be these prostitutes everywhere. Well, it's the tax collectors and their friends who were the patrons of these prostitutes. So when the Pharisees praying in this Gospel about that evil tax collector who's greedy, we understand that now, who's idolatrous, well, he's working for the Romans, and he's adulterous, there we go. You have two extreme examples of people. And both of them were not really good to their own. Now understand the story. Jesus was so fed up with people who thought they were better than others. With people who were convinced of their own self-righteousness, that somehow they had made themselves holy and good. And in the process, and notice what happens, the moment that you do that, you begin to despise others. That's what happened. That's what happens. So Jesus tells this unbelievable parable of two of the most disliked groups of people in all of the land. The Pharisee prays a prayer to himself, not to God. God, I give you thanks that I'm so wonderful. I'm not a villain. I'm not evil. I follow all the rules. I do all of this wonderful stuff. How great am I? The tax collector stands off at a great distance, as far away as he possibly could, never bothering to look up to heaven, but rather looking down with sorrow and guilt, even hitting his own chest. God, please, I know I'm a sinner. I know my life is a mess. I know I'm not doing things the way that I should. Please, please be merciful to me. Jesus says the tax collector goes away justified, and the Pharisee doesn't. Notice what Jesus doesn't say. I think we miss the brilliance of Jesus' storytelling. He doesn't tell you what happens next. We might get scandalized. How could that tax collector be given such generous mercy? He asked for mercy, yeah, but he didn't change his ways. Maybe the very next day he goes back to his office and continues collecting greedy amounts of wealth. Maybe he doesn't stop being adulterous. Maybe he doesn't turn away from his sin. How dare you? How can you be so merciful to him? He didn't necessarily change his ways. God, it's only okay for you to forgive people once they fix their lives, right? Right? Don't we hear that? Isn't this the message we hear too often? That God will be merciful to you only after you've changed your life? Only after you've dealt with your own stuff, your own garbage? Isn't that the message too often Christians say to one another? Oh, God loves you. God will forgive you. But little footnote. You got to fix yourself first. Isn't that what we're told all too often? I don't know if we're half asleep, but this is a yes. Notice the reckless mercy. Notice the abundant gift of forgiveness. Notice the unconditional, and by that I mean God placed no condition on the tax collector receiving mercy. Jesus didn't say in the parable, okay, tax collector, you have to go home and you have to change your life and do a 180 first before you can be justified. No, God gives mercy away recklessly, irresponsibly, super abundantly. There is no condition to God's mercy. And how often do we really believe this? How often have we really ever heard this message? I so often worry that when I hear our fellow Christian brothers and sisters talking about the struggle of sin and the unbelievable mercy of God, it's almost as if, and sometimes it's explicit, there's all kinds of conditions attached. But in this gospel passage, Jesus is profoundly reckless with mercy. There's no conditions. If you cry out for mercy, you receive it. How many, maybe sitting here, but certainly those who haven't even gotten out of bed yet, how many people, right, because of what they were doing last night, how many believe they're not worthy, they're not wanted to come here because they thought there were conditions mercy because they've been told wrongly that there were conditions to them being accepted in our midst. How often has this been the message that's been too quickly and easily shared? How often do we become more like the Pharisee and not enough like the tax collector who longs for mercy? How often is our heart not as pure as that is Jesus, but maybe even more profoundly, how many of us struggle with this ourselves? Oh, we've heard, right? I've said it before. I'm sure somewhere someone has said it to you that God's mercy is unconditional. God's love is unconditional. How hard is that for us to accept? How unbelievably gargantuan of a proposition it is to believe that God actually loves me, even though I'm still broken, even though I'm not yet perfect. And I won't be. I can't be. How hard is it for those of you who live a normal life and then come here on a Sunday morning just like that tax collector, feeling unworthy, feeling like it took all the courage you possibly had to walk through these doors into God's presence, and all you wanted to do was look down and say, I'm not worthy, please be merciful. And the courage it took to come, the courage it takes even to look down, the courage it takes to raise your heart and pray and hope against hope that maybe Jesus hears your prayer. If you get one thing out of our ministry in your 4 years here, one thing, one message, one hope, one promise, and nothing else, it's this: there is no condition to God's mercy. None whatsoever. And if you're wrestling with this, and I know a lot of you are, you may do a fine job of hiding it. But I've been doing this long enough. I can see. I want to help. Whatever you need to wrestle with accepting the unconditional mercy of God, whatever is in the way, let us help. Because Jesus really is trying to convince us in everything he says and in everything he does and in all the stories that he tells. The mercy he longs to offer to us is, in fact, unconditional. And if we just have the slightest bit of hope, the slightest bit of courage to ask for that mercy, we'll receive it.